Today is Wednesday, May 20th, 2026, and I want to take you through the most extraordinary 48 hours in the diplomatic history of this conflict. Because what happened between Sunday evening and Tuesday morning this week was not just another round of Trump ultimatums and Iranian defiance. It was something genuinely unprecedented. The most powerful military on earth was 1 hour away from launching a major attack on Iran. The warships were loaded, the strike packages were authorized, the final order was about to be given. And the people who stopped it were not Iranian diplomats. They were not Pakistani mediators. They were not UN envoys. They were the leaders of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. America's own Gulf allies reached out to the White House at the highest level and told Trump directly, "Do not do this. Not yet. Give us 2 to 3 days. We think we are close." And Trump listened. That is the story that most coverage this week has not told with the depth it deserves. Because the surface narrative is another Trump threat followed by another Trump reversal. But the deeper story is something far more significant. It is the story of how America's Gulf partners have quietly become the single most powerful brake on this conflict. Not through military capability, not through diplomatic leverage over Tehran, but through something far more blunt and far more immediately consequential. They control the airspace and the bases that the United States military needs to operate in this theater. And they are not afraid to use that control. Welcome to Dr. Nora Len. Today is May 20th, 2026. This is the complete breakdown of what happened this week, who called whom, what was said, what it means that Gulf allies are now the ones managing American escalation decisions, and what the Oman talks that open Friday actually tell us about where this war goes from here. Subscribe right now and hit notifications because this story moves every hour and parts 2 through 5 take you deeper into each layer than any single headline has gone. You need all 5 parts to understand the full picture. Let me start with the precise sequence of events. Because the timeline of this week is the story. On Sunday, May 17th, Trump posted on Truth Social warning Iran the clock was ticking and that there would not be anything left of them if they did not get moving fast. That was the same day an Iranian drone struck the perimeter of the Barakah nuclear power plant in Abu Dhabi. Monday evening, after growing frustrated with the state of negotiations and after being given a list of military strike options by senior advisors, Trump was preparing to give his final authorization for what he described as a very major attack. He told reporters later that he was about an hour away from making the decision. And then his administration spoke separately with the leaders of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Those leaders pressed the U.S. to hold off on launching military action in favor of seeing if a diplomatic resolution could be reached. A regional source told CNN the request was tied directly to the expectation that Iran would retaliate against Gulf nations if Trump resumed bombing, as Tehran did at the onset of the war. Trump announced on Truth Social Monday evening that he had called off the planned strike. He said America's allies in the Gulf asked him to wait for 2 to 3 days because they feel they are close to a deal with Iran. There seems to be a very good chance that they can work something out, he said. If we can do that without bombing the hell out of them, I'd be very happy. He said he had planned a very major attack but put it off, for a little while, hopefully, maybe forever. 1 hour away from a very major attack, stopped by phone calls from Riyadh, Doha, and Abu Dhabi. Now let us talk about why those phone calls carry so much weight. Because the Gulf states were not simply making a diplomatic request when they called the White House on Monday evening. They were exercising real operational leverage. And to understand how significant that leverage is, you need to understand what the United States military actually needs from its Gulf partners to conduct operations against Iran. The American military maintains critical facilities across the Gulf region. Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia provides a forward operating platform for strike aircraft and aerial refueling operations. Kuwait provides overflight rights that are geometrically essential for certain approach corridors into Iranian airspace. Oman provides both overflight access and naval logistics that support the blockade operations currently strangling Iranian port access. Qatar hosts Al Udeid Air Base, one of the most significant USA operations hubs in the world and the forward headquarters of CENTCOM. The U.S. military refers to these arrangements as access, basing, and overflight, abbreviated as ABO. An ABO is not a formality. It is the physical infrastructure that makes sustained combat operations in this theater possible. The Gulf states already demonstrated exactly what happens when they withdraw that access. When Trump launched Project Freedom on May 4th, the brief U.S. Navy operation to escort commercial ships through the Strait of Hormuz, Saudi Arabia suspended U.S. access to Prince Sultan Air Base and Saudi airspace. Kuwait simultaneously cut off U.S. access to its bases and airspace. A subsequent phone call between Trump and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman failed to resolve the impasse. Trump was forced to pause Project Freedom within 48 hours, in part to restore U.S. military access to that critical infrastructure. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait later lifted the restrictions, but the message had been delivered with unmistakable clarity. These countries are not passive hosts for American military power. They are partners with their own strategic calculus, and when their interests diverge from Washington's plans, they are willing to act on that divergence immediately and consequentially. Now fast forward to Monday evening. The Gulf leaders who called Trump presented what regional officials described as a unified front. They cited positive momentum in the Pakistan-led mediation efforts. They noted that it was Hajj season, a significant period in Islam that traditionally calls for goodwill, with thousands of pilgrims traveling to Mecca. And they stressed a point that carries the most operational weight of all. One regional source told CNN that the request was tied to the expectation that Iran would retaliate against Gulf nations if Trump resumed bombing. Although nations in the region say they are still able to defend themselves, there is a sense that a prolonged renewal of fighting could strain resources and leave those nations and their critical energy infrastructure vulnerable. The UAE has also voiced opposition to additional U.S. military operations and may similarly move to limit U.S. base access if strikes resume, according to a U.S. official. Any restrictions on base access or overflight by those countries would undoubtedly complicate U.S. operations going forward. The Gulf states were not calling Washington with a diplomatic suggestion. They were calling with an implicit warning about what American military capability in this theater would look like if their concerns were not respected. Here is the dimension of this story that has received almost no analytical attention. And it is arguably the most important strategic development of the entire war. The Gulf states have completely reversed their posture from where they started on February 28. Go back to the opening days of this conflict. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had pushed Trump ahead of the truce to keep fighting Iran and had even urged a ground invasion. Senior Saudi defense officials told U.S. counterparts that if Trump did not follow through on his threats, it would only embolden the regime. Saudi Arabia was, in the early weeks, arguably pushing Washington toward more escalation, not less. The UAE ambassador to the United States said a simple ceasefire was not enough and called for a conclusive outcome against Iran. UAE Presidential Advisor Anwar Gargash said the war needed to end with a long-term solution and discouraged any ceasefire that would not accomplish that. These were the countries demanding harder action in March. They are the countries calling for restraint in May. What changed? The answer is everything. Iran has fired a total of 438 ballistic missiles, 2012 drones, and 19 cruise missiles at targets in the UAE alone, according to the UAE Ministry of Defense, as of April 1st. Those numbers have continued growing since. An Iranian drone struck the perimeter of the Barakah nuclear power plant on May 17. Dubai's hotel occupancy has fallen to 10% in the second quarter of 2026 compared with 80% before the war began, according to Moody's Analytics, which described the decline as an effective shutdown of large parts of the hospitality sector. Qatar's liquefied natural gas exports have ground to a halt, with the Gulf nation extending its force majeure on LNG through June. Saudi Arabia is managing to export around 5 million barrels per day via its east-west pipeline that bypasses Hormuz, but that pipeline was never designed to carry the full load of Saudi export capacity, and the strain is showing. These countries are exhausted. They have been running their air defense networks at extraordinary operational tempo for nearly 80 days. They have absorbed thousands of incoming weapons. They have watched their tourism industries collapse, their LNG exports freeze, their insurance markets seize, and their civilian populations endure the kind of security environment that no Gulf monarchy wants to normalize as a permanent feature of domestic life. They wanted this war to end Iran's threat capacity conclusively in March. By May, they want it to end. The distinction between those two objectives has become the most important fault line in the entire coalition. And that fault line runs directly through the decision that Trump was 1 hour away from making on Monday evening. Now let us talk about what the Oman talks that opened Friday actually represent. Because the sequence of events that produced those talks is itself a story about how this diplomatic process has operated since April 8th, and what the structure of the negotiations reveals about how far apart the two sides still are. After Trump issued his 2 to 3 day ultimatum on Tuesday, the Iranians said they wanted to move planned talks from Istanbul to Oman and hold them in a strictly bilateral format, limited only to nuclear issues. Washington initially rejected the format change. Then a senior U.S. official told Axios, "We told them it is this or nothing, and they said okay, then nothing." For several hours on Wednesday, the talks appeared to have collapsed entirely before they had even begun. Then 9 countries from the region reached out to the White House at the highest levels, strongly urging the U.S. not to cancel the meeting. The Trump administration agreed to hold the meeting to be respectful to U.S. allies in the region and in order to continue pursuing the diplomatic track, according to a U.S. official. Iran's insistence on moving to Oman and limiting the agenda to nuclear issues only is not a procedural request. It is a structural negotiating position. Iran has insisted from the outset that discussions be limited strictly to its nuclear program, while Washington has pushed to include ballistic missiles, proxy networks, and the Hormuz governance question, including the PGSA toll authority. Senior Iranian lawmakers have stated publicly that enrichment rights, missile range, and support for regional allies are red lines that will not be touched under any circumstances. By demanding Oman and a nuclear-only agenda, Iran is attempting to get on paper what it has been insisting on verbally throughout the conflict: a negotiating framework that excludes the issues where the gap between the two sides is largest. Witkoff met with Netanyahu in Israel on Tuesday before flying to Oman, and was briefed on Israel's latest intelligence on Iran. Netanyahu told him directly that Iran cannot be trusted. That framing from Jerusalem sets the floor below which Washington's negotiating flexibility cannot go. Any agreement that does not satisfy Israeli security requirements on the nuclear file faces the risk of being undermined by Israeli military action independently, regardless of what the United States and Iran agree to bilaterally. The presence of CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper in the U.S. delegation alongside Witkoff and Kushner is also notable. Bringing the commander of U.S. military forces in the region to a diplomatic negotiation is a message. It communicates that the military option sitting in the background of every word exchanged in that room in Muscat is not theoretical. It is operational and it is ready. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi confirmed talks were scheduled in Muscat for Friday morning at 10 a.m. local time. Both parties indicated they expected further meetings in the coming days. Araghchi called it a good start. The U.S. team described itself as deeply skeptical. That gap between good start and deeply skeptical is where everything stands on May 20, 2026. Here is the honest picture of where everything lands today and what the next week actually looks like if you read all of the signals together without the diplomatic noise. Trump has given Iran 2 to 3 days. He called off a very major attack on Monday evening at the request of Gulf allies who told him they were close to a deal. He acknowledged the following day that Iran still has a little capacity to strike others in the region. Not much, but a little. He told reporters it could be Friday, could be the weekend, could be early next week when describing the timeline for potential resumed strikes. He also said the higher gas prices averaging $4.53 per gallon across the United States right now are peanuts compared to preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon. The latest inflation report confirmed prices are at their highest level in 3 years, driven by the Hormuz closure. His approval ratings on the economy are sinking. Democratic lawmakers are calling his comments out of touch with the struggles of ordinary Americans. And multiple Republican voices in Congress are growing quietly impatient with a war that has now lasted nearly 3 times longer than the 6 weeks Trump initially projected. Iran, for its part, has vowed to open new fronts against the United States if strikes resume. Reports this week indicate Iran is also considering whether to impose control over the subsea cables running through its waters, which provide internet connectivity and transmit data to countries across the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. That would be an escalation of a different character entirely. Not missiles and drones at military and energy infrastructure, but a deliberate severing of the digital infrastructure that underpins the entire regional economy. It is a signal that Tehran's escalation ladder still has rungs above where it currently stands. The Gulf states who called Trump on Monday evening are sitting with a very specific fear that CNN's reporting made explicit. They are worried that a renewed American bombing campaign would trigger another wave of Iranian retaliation against their territory, their energy infrastructure, and their civilian populations at a moment when their air defense inventories are already significantly lower than they were on February 28. They are also worried that further escalation would permanently extinguish any possibility of a negotiated settlement that they, as neighbors to Iran for the rest of human history, will ultimately need to live with regardless of how this war ends militarily. That is the strategic bind every Gulf capital is sitting inside right now. They want Iran's threat capacity ended. They do not want another round of Iranian missiles raining down on their cities, nuclear plants, oil terminals, and hotel districts to get there. And they are using every tool available to them, including control over American military access to their airspace and bases, to manage the pace of escalation in a way that keeps the diplomatic track alive even as it runs directly into the wall of Iranian intransigence on enrichment and missiles. The Oman talks are the last visible off-ramp before that wall becomes impossible to navigate around. Iran knows this. Washington knows this. The Gulf states know this. And the entire world, watching Brent crude hover above $100 per barrel, watching inflation climb to 3-year highs, watching 20,000 sailors remain trapped in the Persian Gulf, is waiting to find out which direction this goes when the 2 to 3 days Trump promised his Gulf allies finally run out. Subscribe to Dr. Nora Len right now and hit that notification bell. When the outcome of the Oman talks becomes clear, when Trump's self-imposed deadline expires, and when the next move comes from either Washington or Tehran, we will be here breaking it down with the sourcing and the depth this story demands. Drop your read on what happens next in the comments below, because the question that matters most today is this. When the Gulf states asked Trump to wait, they bought 2 to 3 days. What happens on day 4?